What if the person you trusted the most was hiding a dark secret? A secret so horrifying that it would end in an unthinkable tragedy? Jakaira Ortiz, a bright and loving 24-year-old woman, vanished without a trace, only to be found lifeless in a place she once called home. But the circumstances surrounding her death are as chilling as they are perplexing. Who would want Jakaira dead? And why? The answers to these questions will send shivers down your spine. Before we dive into this gripping true crime case, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more shocking and mysterious stories. Now let's begin. Jakaira Ortiz was the kind of person who left a lasting impression on everyone she met. Her infectious laughter, radiant energy, and compassionate heart made her a cherished friend, sister, and daughter. But on the evening of January 4th, 2025, everything changed. Jakaira was nowhere to be found. Her phone went straight to voicemail, her social media activity stopped, and all calls to her remained unanswered. To her family, this was not just unusual, it was terrifying. Her brother, Paris Austin, was the first to notice something was wrong. He had sent her a message that morning, a simple "Good morning, sis, hope you're okay." But hours passed, and there was no response. Concern turned into panic when Jakaira failed to show up for work. Paris called her fiancé, Julian Goode-Wallace, a man who had always seemed devoted to Jakaira. But Julian's response was cold. "She probably just needed some space," he muttered. But Paris knew his sister better than that. Something was very, very wrong. As night fell, the Ortiz family contacted the Fayetteville Police Department to report Jakaira missing. The officers assured them they would investigate, but deep down, Paris knew he couldn't just wait for answers. He had to find his sister himself. He called Jakaira's best friend, Alicia, who told him something even more disturbing. "She texted me at midnight," Alicia revealed. "She said she was scared, that something didn't feel right, but she never told me why." The hairs on Paris' arms stood on end. Why would Jakaira be scared in her own home? He drove straight to her apartment on Tamarack Drive, pounding on the door. No answer. The curtains were drawn, and the house was eerily silent. A neighbor mentioned they had heard shouting late at night, followed by a loud thud. It was the last time anyone had heard anything from that apartment. The next morning, Fayetteville police forced their way into Jakaira's apartment. The air inside was heavy, thick with something that sent a shiver through the responding officers. As they moved through the small space, their flashlights illuminated the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. And then they saw it. In the bedroom, partially covered by a blanket, lay Jakaira Ortiz's lifeless body. Blood had pooled beneath her, staining the white bedsheets a deep, horrifying red. Her arms bore deep bruises, her lip was split, and her once bright eyes were frozen in terror. This was no accident. This was murder. At the time of her death, Jakaira had been engaged to Julian Goode-Wallace, a man she had met 3 years earlier. Their love story had seemed like a fairy tale at first. Julian was charming, attentive, and ambitious. He showered her with gifts, whispered promises of forever, and even moved in with her after just 6 months of dating. But behind closed doors, the fairy tale had started to crack. Friends began to notice small things. Jakaira stopped going out as often. Her laughter became less frequent. She flinched at sudden movements. Alicia had once asked her, "Is everything okay with Julian?" Jakaira had forced a smile. "Yeah, he just gets angry sometimes." But no one knew just how dark things had become. Julian's reaction to Jakaira's death was bizarre. When police informed him of the murder, he barely flinched. "That's crazy," he said, as if he were talking about a stranger. "I told you guys, I haven't seen her since yesterday." But his alibi had holes. He claimed he had been at work all night, but security footage from his job showed him leaving around 10 p.m., right around the time neighbors heard that loud thud from Jakaira's apartment. Then there were the text messages. "I don't feel safe," Jakaira had written to Alicia. "He's different tonight. If anything happens, just know I love you." Police now had their prime suspect. Julian had always played the role of the perfect fiancé. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a man with a violent past. Ex-girlfriends came forward with chilling stories of manipulation and physical abuse. One woman even admitted, "I thought he was going to kill me one night." Paris Austin couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never liked Julian, but he never imagined his sister's fiancé could be capable of something this horrifying. He sat in the police station, staring at a grainy image from the security footage. Julian, leaving the apartment complex. Alone. The evidence was piling up. But would it be enough? On January 6, 2025, police made their move. Officers surrounded Julian's car as he pulled into a gas station. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands up," one officer commanded. Julian hesitated, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, before finally complying. He didn't ask why he was being arrested. He already knew. Charged with first-degree murder, Julian was taken into custody, where he refused to say a word. But his silence spoke volumes. Julian Goode-Wallace sat in the cold interrogation room of the Cumberland County Detention Center, his hands cuffed to the metal table. The fluorescent light above him buzzed faintly, casting eerie shadows on his face. His expression was unreadable. No tears, no anger, no confusion. Just an empty, chilling stare. Detective Scott Shirey sat across from him, placing a file on the table. Inside were pictures of Jakaira's lifeless body, the blood-soaked sheets, the bruises, the broken lip. "Explain this," the detective demanded, pushing the gruesome images toward him. Julian didn't flinch. He simply leaned back and exhaled. "I have nothing to say." But silence would not save him. Investigators were already piecing together the final moments of Jakaira's life, and the more they uncovered, the more twisted the story became. Neighbors had heard more than just a thud. They had heard Jakaira scream. "Stop, Julian. Please," one witness recalled hearing. It was a plea filled with terror, followed by the sickening sound of a struggle. The walls of the apartment were thin, the violence had been loud, yet no one had called the police. Now, everyone regretted it. Regret. A heavy, unshakable burden. But Julian felt nothing. Paris Austin sat in the waiting area of the police station, his leg bouncing impatiently. His mind was racing, replaying the last moments he had seen his sister alive. Had she been trying to tell him something? Had he missed the signs? The anger inside him burned like wildfire. When Detective Shirey finally stepped out of the interrogation room, Paris was on him in seconds. What did he say? Did he admit it? His voice was sharp, filled with desperation. Shirey shook his head. "He's not talking, but we have enough to charge him." Paris clenched his fists. Enough to charge him, but will it be enough to convict him? Julian had always been a manipulator. He knew how to twist words, how to lie convincingly. What if he got away with it? That thought alone made Paris' blood boil. Jakaira deserved justice. No, she deserved more than that. She deserved to be alive. Chapter 10. The Secrets Behind Closed Doors. The investigation revealed something even darker. Julian had a pattern of abuse that no one had seen before. Ex-girlfriends began coming forward, one by one, each with horrifying stories. Sandra Martinez, an old college flame, described how Julian had once locked her in his apartment for an entire weekend after an argument, starving her and only letting her out after she begged. "I thought he was going to kill me," she whispered through tears. Another woman, Michelle Carter, shared how Julian had threatened to burn down her house after she tried to leave him. The stories painted a picture of a man who thrived on control, on fear. But none of his past victims had reported him. They had all been too scared. Now they were all living with guilt. Could they have saved Jakaira if they had spoken up sooner? Jakaira had never told her family the full extent of what she had been going through. She had always been the strong one, the one who comforted others, not the one who needed saving. But behind the scenes, her life with Julian had been unraveling for months. Alicia, her best friend, finally broke down and revealed what Jakaira had confided in her weeks before her death. She was scared of him, Alicia admitted. She wanted to leave, but she didn't know how. Julian had threatened her, saying that if she ever left him, she wouldn't live to see another day. Jakaira had laughed it off at the time, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just an empty threat. She had been planning to run, to pack her things and leave while he was at work. But she never got the chance. The autopsy confirmed what the investigators had already suspected. Jakaira had fought for her life. Defensive wounds covered her hands. Deep bruises wrapped around her neck where Julian had tried to strangle her. But the most chilling detail? She had survived the initial attack. The medical examiner found evidence that she had been alive for several minutes after the fatal blow, long enough to feel the life slipping out of her body. Julian hadn't just killed her in a fit of rage. He had watched her die. That realization sent shockwaves through everyone who heard it. Jakaira had died alone, terrified, knowing that the man she once loved was the one stealing her last breath. It was the kind of evil that made your skin crawl. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Julian's lawyer pleaded not guilty on his behalf, claiming that Jakaira's death had been an accident. The media swarmed the courthouse, covering every second of the pretrial hearings. Julian, dressed in an expensive suit, played the role of the grieving fiancé, his face blank yet carefully crafted for the cameras. His lawyer, a slick and confident man named Marcus Delaney, argued that there was no clear motive for murder. Julian loved Jakaira, he insisted. Why would he kill the woman he planned to marry? The answer was obvious to everyone who knew the truth. Because he couldn't control her anymore. And for a man like Julian, losing control meant losing everything. While Julian sat in his cell, awaiting trial, more details surfaced that shattered his carefully crafted defense. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station caught Julian dumping a plastic bag into a dumpster just hours after the murder. Police recovered it and found Jakaira's shattered phone inside. The screen was cracked, the messages deleted, but forensic experts managed to retrieve one chilling text that Jakaira had sent just hours before her death. If anything happens to me tonight, Julian did it. That text was the final nail in Julian's coffin. But the trial was still ahead, and Julian had one last trick up his sleeve. Just when the case seemed open and shut, Julian dropped a bombshell in court. He claimed Jakaira had been having an affair. His lawyer spun an elaborate story, suggesting that she had been seeing someone else, and the real killer might be out there. It was a desperate move, a clear attempt to shift blame, but the jury couldn't ignore it. Paris, sitting in the courtroom, clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. How dare he? How dare he try to smear her name when she wasn't here to defend herself? But that was Julian's nature, a liar, a manipulator, a monster. The only question now was, would the jury see through the deception? The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The prosecution had painted Julian as a calculating, abusive fiancé who had snapped when Jakaira finally decided to leave him. But Julian's defense team was relentless, pushing the narrative that Jakaira had been unfaithful and that someone else could have been responsible for her murder. His lawyer, Marcus Delaney, pounded the table dramatically. "There is no physical evidence tying Julian to the crime," he roared, as if volume alone could erase the damning facts. The jury was visibly torn. The medical examiner had confirmed Jakaira's death was no accident, but without a direct confession or an eyewitness, Julian's defense still had room to maneuver. Paris sat in the front row, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. How could they even entertain the idea that Julian was innocent? His sister had literally sent a text naming her killer. But in a court of law, justice wasn't always about the truth. It was about who told the most convincing story. The prosecution had one last weapon, Jakaira's own words. While going through her belongings, Paris had found an old notebook she used as a diary. Buried within its pages was an entry that would shake the courtroom to its core. Dated just a month before her death, Jakaira had written, "Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I just disappeared. Would Julian even care? Or would he finally be free to do what he wants? He scares me. But every time I think about leaving, I remember what he told me. If you ever try to leave me, I'll make sure no one ever finds you." Paris handed the notebook over to the prosecutor, his heart pounding. This was the evidence they needed. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as the words were read aloud. Jakaira had known she was in danger. She had known Julian was capable of killing her. And now, from beyond the grave, she was testifying against him. Julian's face remained expressionless as the diary entry was read. His lawyer immediately objected, claiming that the notebook was hearsay and should be inadmissible in court. But the judge allowed it, and for the first time, cracks began to form in Julian's cold demeanor. He shifted in his seat, rubbing his temples. He knew this was bad. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. When he finally spoke on the stand, his voice was calm, collected. "I loved Jakaira," he said smoothly. "I never hurt her. We had arguments, sure. But I would never. I could never do something like this. He looked at the jury, his eyes pleading. She was my world. But the problem with Julian was that his performance was too perfect, too rehearsed, too cold. Then a bombshell dropped. The apartment complex where Jakaira lived had security cameras, but investigators had discovered something suspicious. A section of the footage from the night of the murder was missing. The footage from Julian arriving at the apartment that evening was there. But the footage of him leaving? Gone. Police recovered logs showing that someone had manually deleted files from the security system at 3:47 a.m., hours after Jakaira's estimated time of death. Julian had always been tech-savvy. He had worked in IT. He knew how to erase evidence. But what he didn't know was that a copy of the footage had been automatically backed up to the apartment complex's central server. And in that footage was something that would destroy his alibi completely. When the recovered footage was finally played in court, Julian's face drained of all color. There he was, leaving the apartment in the dead of night, carrying a large duffel bag. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicking. He was calm, methodical. Prosecutors argued that the bag contained Jakaira's phone, the murder weapon, and possibly even clothes soaked in her blood. Julian's lawyer scrambled to explain it away. He suggested Julian had been taking out trash, or maybe doing laundry. But the jury wasn't buying it. Julian had lied. He had claimed he left the apartment hours earlier. Now, with this footage, that lie was undeniable. The case against him was tightening like a noose. Paris had tried to stay strong throughout the trial, but when it was his turn to testify, he felt his emotions crashing down on him. Taking a deep breath, he looked at the jury and began. Jakaira wasn't just my sister. She was my best friend. And Julian took her from us. He recounted their last conversations, the way Jakaira had been pulling away from her friends, how she had told him she was afraid but hadn't wanted to worry anyone. His voice broke as he spoke about identifying her body. I'll never forget seeing her like that, lifeless. I'll never forgive him for that. The jury listened, their faces etched with sadness. Paris wasn't just giving testimony. He was speaking for Jakaira, for the life she had lost. Julian was still holding on to hope, but his world shattered when a forensic analyst took the stand. The analyst had managed to recover fragments of a deleted text from Julian's phone. The message? I told you what would happen if you left me. The prosecution pounced on this. It was clear Julian had killed Jakaira out of control and rage. The defense fought back, claiming the message was taken out of context, but at this point, no one believed them. After weeks of grueling testimony, it was time for the jury to decide Julian's fate. Hours passed, then days. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. But finally, on the third day, the jury returned. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. We find the defendant guilty. Paris let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Julian barely reacted. He just sat there, his jaw clenched, his hands folded neatly in front of him. It was over. The judge did not hesitate. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Julian finally cracked. His mask slipped, and for the first time, his eyes burned with pure hatred. He turned, locking eyes with Paris. This isn't over, he mouthed. But it was. For Jakaira, for her family, and for justice, it was over. After the trial, Paris found himself adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. The justice system had done its part, but closure was elusive. Returning to Jakaira's now empty apartment to collect her belongings was like stepping into a time capsule. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the air, and a half-read novel lay on her bedside table. Every corner whispered her name, taunting Paris with what could have been. Grief was a constant companion, creeping into his dreams and shadowing his every thought. Yet, amidst the heartache, he found moments of resolve, swearing to honor Jakaira's memory in any way he could. Paris began to channel his sorrow into action, joining local advocacy groups that supported victims of domestic abuse. Speaking at community centers and schools, he shared Jakaira's story, emphasizing the hidden dangers of toxic relationships. People listened, some with tears in their eyes, others with nods of recognition, realizing the quiet battles fought behind closed doors. For Paris, these moments offered a semblance of healing, as though with each person he reached, a small piece of his sister lived on. Jakaira had always been a light in the world, and now, through him, that light continued to shine. Julian's life in prison was a stark contrast to the controlled world he had tried to dominate outside. Stripped of his power and influence, he quickly became just another inmate. The towering walls and steel bars were a constant reminder of the life he had thrown away. Despite his attempts to assert dominance, his fellow inmates saw through him, recognizing the cowardice beneath his facade. The man who had once wielded fear like a weapon now found himself on the receiving end, isolated and despised. Julian's lawyers filed appeal after appeal, each more desperate than the last, claiming procedural errors and ineffective counsel. But the courts were unswayed, dismissing his petitions without hesitation. As the years dragged on, Julian's visitors dwindled to none, leaving him to contemplate his actions in solitude. His cell became a place of torment, haunted by memories of Jakaira's final moments. Yet even in isolation, he refused to admit his guilt, clinging to the twisted narrative he had spun to justify his actions. But the walls, indifferent and unyielding, stood as a silent testament to his guilt. The community of Fayetteville was forever changed by Jakaira's death. Vigils were held, candles flickering in the night like beacons of solidarity and sorrow. Residents rallied together, creating a local initiative called Jakaira's Voice, aimed at providing resources and support for those trapped in abusive relationships. Paris became a leading figure in the initiative, offering empathy and guidance to those who needed it most. His sister's legacy became a force for change, empowering others to seek help and find their own voices. Jakaira's story reached beyond Fayetteville, capturing the attention of national media. Documentaries and articles explored the complexities of domestic violence and the fatal consequences of silence. The narrative became a cautionary tale, urging society to recognize the red flags of emotional and physical abuse. Her memory served as a catalyst, inspiring new legislation aimed at protecting vulnerable individuals. In death, Jakaira had become a symbol of resilience and a warning to all who ignored the silent cries for help. For Paris, healing was not a linear journey, but a winding path filled with setbacks and small victories. Some days, he could laugh at memories of Jakaira, her infectious smile, and the way she could lighten any room. Other days, the weight of loss was suffocating, dragging him into a darkness that felt impossible to escape. Therapy became a cornerstone in his life, offering a safe space to explore his grief and guilt without judgment. Each session was a step toward reclaiming his peace, slowly stitching together the fragments of his shattered heart. Paris often visited Jakaira's grave, the grass around it growing lush and green as the seasons passed. He would bring flowers, her favorites, lilies and sunflowers, and speak to her as if she were still there, listening with that same loving patience. "We're making a difference, sis," he'd whisper, the wind carrying his words into the unknown. In these quiet moments, he felt her presence, a comforting warmth that eased his sorrow. Though her life had been cut short, her impact remained, rippling through the lives she had touched and the change she had inspired. Years after the trial, Paris stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the Jakaira Ortiz Center for Domestic Violence Survivors, a sanctuary built in her honor. The center offered counseling, legal aid, and shelter for those fleeing abusive situations. As Paris spoke to the gathered crowd, his voice was strong, filled with purpose. "This center is not just a building, it's a promise. A promise that no one will have to endure what my sister did." Jakaira's legacy is one of love, strength, and unwavering courage. The center quickly became a refuge for many, its walls echoing with stories of survival and hope. Volunteers, many of whom had once been victims themselves, offered compassion and understanding, helping others reclaim their lives. Paris, standing in the heart of it all, saw the embodiment of Jakaira's spirit in every success story. Each person who walked through those doors was a testament to her enduring impact, a living proof that love and support could conquer even the deepest scars of pain. On the anniversary of Jakaira's death, Paris hosted a memorial concert, inviting local musicians and artists to perform in her memory. The event, held under a starlit sky, was a celebration of her life, a tribute filled with laughter, tears, and music. Friends and strangers alike shared stories of how Jakaira had touched their lives, her spirit woven into the fabric of their memories. As the final song played, a soft, soulful melody, balloons were released into the night, each one carrying a message of love and remembrance. Paris watched the balloons drift higher, his heart heavy yet hopeful. Jakaira was gone, but she was not forgotten. Her story had become a beacon, guiding those lost in the darkness of abuse toward the light of freedom and safety. As the night deepened and the crowd dispersed, Paris stood alone, gazing up at the stars. "We did it, sis," he whispered. "We made sure they'll never forget you." And in that quiet, infinite expanse, it felt as though Jakaira was smiling down, her legacy a radiant, unbreakable force. A legacy born from tragedy, but thriving in the love she had left behind. This case is far from over. As the trial unfolds, secrets will be exposed, betrayals will be revealed, and the truth behind Jakaira's final moments will come to light. Will justice prevail? Or will Julian find a way to escape the punishment he deserves? Stay tuned for the next chapters as we uncover the dark and twisted reality behind this shocking case. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories.